I'm pleased to introduce you to the Organizational Courage Assessment, first published in 2002, which was partly inspired by the many courageous acts that took place on September 11, 2001. But instead of relying on interviews and stories to document acts of courage, which had been the usual approach, my two co-authors and I developed the first self-report quantitative assessment of courage in the workplace. By way of background, in order for organizations to succeed in the short term, members must do what is required, perform their jobs, follow the standard operating procedures, and respect the decisions of their managers. But to succeed in the long term, it may be necessary for members to challenge traditional practices, confront their managers and coworkers, and bypass official policies and procedures, which takes courage, since members may receive negative consequences for not following the organization's accepted ways of doing things. Some of the negative consequences that members might receive for their courageous acts include ridicule, criticism, reprimands, negative performance reviews, or even the loss of their job. Courage is defined as doing the right thing, such as serving a customer's needs, helping a person in trouble, or sidestepping dysfunctional procedures, even though you might receive repercussions and disciplinary action for your noble behavior. Courage thus involves risk, but is silently supported in some workplaces because it's the only way the organization can succeed while being thoroughly enmeshed in outdated rules and procedures, autocratic managers, and dysfunctional cultural norms. The courage assessment identifies 20 possible acts of courage across a wide range of experiences in organizations. You are asked to respond to these 20 acts in two different ways. First, you are asked to indicate how often you have observed these acts of courage in your organization, or if any of these acts are simply not necessary to perform because members have already been doing what is needed for the long-term success of your organization. Second, for these same 20 possible acts of courage, you are asked to indicate how afraid people would be of receiving negative consequences if they perform these acts in your organization. As shown on this diagram, the courage assessment defines 4 types of organizations with respect to the relative frequency of observing potential acts of courage and the relative fear in performing these acts of courage. On the top left quadrant, we have fearful organizations. If you have observed few acts of courage, and yet there is considerable fear present, then your organization is fearful. It is fear that is keeping members from doing what needs to be done for the long-term success of their organization and their own psychological well-being. Unless this fear is removed, members may continue doing what is required by the organization for short-term survival, but long-term success is at risk. On the bottom left quadrant, we have bureaucratic organizations. If you have observed few acts of courage and do not experience the fear of receiving negative consequences, your organization is bureaucratic. Apparently, members have resigned themselves to doing only what is officially and clearly outlined in their jobs. Hence, members are only doing what is expected and stipulated. Fear is not felt when people have given up trying to improve the system. Sadly, no one is fighting for the organization's future. On the top right quadrant, we have courageous organizations. If you have observed frequent acts of courage in your organization, and yet these acts were performed even though there was considerable fear of receiving negative consequences for not following the organization's accepted ways of doing things, your organization is courageous. Thus, the potential acts of courage are indeed actual acts of courage because they were performed despite the fear, which is the defining quality of courage. On the bottom right quadrant, we have quantum organizations. If you have observed those 20 acts frequently, while there is little fear of receiving negative consequences for performing those acts, your organization is defined as quantum. The necessary acts were performed, but members did not have to act with fear. Instead, they were supported by the formal and informal systems in the organization, including their leaders. Perhaps this would be a good time to mention the biggest surprise I had while my co-authors and I were developing the courage assessment. We had initially assumed that the best organization would be the courageous one. It sounded so good. People would be doing what is needed for success, even if that meant they might receive negative consequences for bypassing the formal systems and informal rules. We saw that kind of behavior as empowering, even heroic. And yet, when we saw the 4 types of organizations emerge from our statistical analyses, this simple question came to mind. Why do people have to live in fear? We also realized that, long term, there is a huge cost to live with fear, including stress, which leads to most chronic diseases, not to mention that people's energies and talents would eventually be drained by having to live with all that fear and stress. When we saw that particular combination emerge, with people doing the right things without fear, it became apparent that we had unlocked a key aspect of the quantum organization. After you've completed your responses to both Part 1 and Part 2 of the Courage Assessment, you'll instantly receive your 2 courage scores, your observe score and your fear score, each of which can vary from 0 to 80. Then you are asked to download a free PDF file that enables you to first graph and then interpret your results. Here is the figure for graphing your 2 courage scores and thus determining whether your organization is fearful, bureaucratic, courageous, or quantum. In most cases, your results will neatly fit into one of the 4 quadrants. But if any of your scores happen to fall right on the boundary, that is, on the 40 line on either the horizontal or the vertical axes, then your organization is a mixture of 2 overlapping types. By the way, the PDF file also includes additional graphs, so you can plot the average results for your workgroup, department, as well as your entire organization. When many people in the same organization respond to the courage assessment, it's useful to see how courage scores can vary across the areas and levels in the organization. Oftentimes, for example, the top of the organization is quantum. The middle of the organization is courageous, but the lower levels are a mixture of fearful and bureaucratic, which makes it challenging for most employees to do what is best for the long-term success of their organization. So it's always a good idea to sample many members across all levels and areas in order to have more confidence in the results of any self-report assessment. 2 action recommendations are usually suggested from the results of the courage assessment. First, an organization that is assessed as bureaucratic or fearful or courageous can then become a quantum organization, applying the available programs and processes of organizational transformation. Through such a transformation, members will be empowered to act on their internalized sense of what is in the best interest of the organization, both in the short term and the long term. These members can also be empowered to reinvent the organization's systems, processes, and practices in order to be more in sync with today's turbulent world, while driving out fear and its negative consequences. If an organization-wide transformation is just not feasible, then the members in either a bureaucratic or fearful organization will have to become more courageous to do what is needed for long-term success, despite the risks of receiving negative consequences for challenging traditional practices, confronting their managers and coworkers, and ignoring official policies and procedures. Without performing the necessary acts of courage in a fearful or bureaucratic organization, And thus, without a personal transformation of the members, the danger arises of people living with fear, or worse yet, giving up all hope for the future. The arrows on this figure show the different combinations of personal and organizational transformation to eventually move from a bureaucratic or fearful organization to a courageous or quantum organization. In sum, the courage assessment not only provides systematic, quantitative results for any organization, but also opens the discussion on a topic that has usually been silent or suppressed. Even better, once the results of the courage assessment are discussed in groups, it's easier for the leaders and managers to consider what combination of personal and organizational transformation will provide their organization with the best chances for long-term survival and success.